Wait. There we go. Over to you, Rabbi Shisler. There we go.
Boker Tov. I want to start with a question. What is, chronologically speaking, the last book of the Tanakh? Chronologically, what's the latest, if you note, the most recent, rather strange way of putting it, but the most recent stuff written in the Tanakh? What's the last book of the Tanakh? Look, normally speaking, open the Tanakh, what's the last book you'll find there? Divrei Yamim. But that's not chronologically the last thing written in the Tanakh. What is chronologically? What's the latest piece of history written in the Tanakh? The answer is Nehemiah. Ezra and the books of Ezra and then Nehemiah. Right? Ezra and Nehemiah. Those books talk about the return from the Babylonian exile. Okay? And the rebuilding of the temple, which you will know was sanctioned by Cyrus of Iran, and which not infrequently today you will hear Iranians talking about the fact that it was such a wonderful relationship between the Jews and the Iranians, even as far back as that their King Cyrus allowed the Jews to go back and rebuild their temple, which is true. Okay, now roughly, does anybody have a clue? You probably don't, you didn't know it was the book of the Nehemiah. Have you got a clue when that is dated to, roughly?
550 BC.
That's a very good guess. You're about 100 years out. But no, but it's a very, seriously, it was a really very intelligent, sensible guess. It's roughly 450 BCE. Okay, now here's a really interesting question. What is the next piece of recorded history about the Jews after the close of the book of Nehemiah? When is the next time we read about Jewish history after the book of Nehemiah? No, after the book of Nehemiah. That Daniel is still in the Tanakh.
Maccabees.
It's the Maccabees. And where will you find the books of the Maccabees? In the Apocrypha. We'll come back to that in a sec. But when did the Maccabees live? The Maccabees are about 160 BCE. Yes, very, very good. There's roughly 300 years between the close of the Tanakh and the next piece of recorded history, the Maccabees. What happened in those 300 years? Where's it written down what the Jews were doing for those 300 years? Well, the answer is it's not written anywhere. These are what scholars sometimes call the Jewish Dark Ages. There's no history as such recorded about the Jewish people for roughly 300 years. So does that mean that nothing happened? Well, it can't, for the obvious reason that if Judaism, as it were, had died after the book of Nehemiah, what were the Maccabees doing 300 years later? They were fighting for Judaism. So Judaism must have still been in existence. It must have still been developing or whatever. In fact, there is evidence from other sources about the Jewish community, but there's no Jewish history as such recorded. There is the Elephantine Papyri. The Elephantine Papyri was a large collection. It was originally found in 1890 on Elephantine, which is an island in the Nile. And it must be quite a large island because there was a large colony there, and lots of the people who lived there were actually Jewish. There was a very vibrant Jewish community on Elephantine. There's a letter, 407 BCE, addressed to the Persian governor of Judah, asking for his assistance in rebuilding their temple, which had been desecrated and destroyed by anti-Semites. What do they say? French, place même chose. Now, even then, they were concerned about anti-Semitism. So we know that there were Jews living in Egypt in Elephantine. There's the Zenon papyri that were discovered 1914, 15 in Egypt. And they contain, it's a very large collection of about 2,000 papyri. Zenon was a very high-ranking Egyptian official, and he did a lot of traveling around, and he actually did business around the world. And he mentions a very important Jewish leader called Tobias, and there's other stuff recorded about the Jewish community in the Zenon papyri. Now, the Septuagint was written around this time, about the 3rd century BCE. What's the Septuagint? The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Bible, and you will be familiar with the story. 72 Ptolemy wanted rather a translation of Tanakh. You know what I'm talking about? Are you familiar with this story? Don't look at me blankly. I'm slightly surprised because it's a very, very famous story. It's contained in the letter Aristeas, which is one of these things that's floated around for years, really, really many years, and people know of. It talks about the fact that King Ptolemy had one of the biggest libraries in the world, but he didn't have the Jewish stuff, and he wanted it. And he arranged got 72 scholars sent to Alexandria, and they all went into 72 different little tiny rooms, and they were all told to translate the Bible, the Jewish Bible, into Greek, which they did, and miraculously, they all translated it exactly the same, identically, which is a complete miracle, put it mildly. Translations are very difficult. I never like the word translation, because you cannot say exactly in another language the same thing. I'll just give you the most stupid example. You can say in English, I walked down the street, you say I went down the street. They both mean exactly the same thing. How many translations are there of the Bible? Of the Quran, of the Tanakh? How many translations are there in existence? I don't know. Hundreds? Are they different? Yeah. But how many Hebrew versions are there of the Tanakh? Exactly. It shows you how difficult it is to go from one language into the other. Anyway, the Septuagint was said to have been written, the translation into Greek, in the 3rd century. The Apocrypha records lots. What is the Apocrypha? Well, in Hebrew, the word Apocrypha, the Hebrew expression for the Apocrypha is Sfarim Chitzonim, the outside books. Here's something to think about. There are 24 books in the Tanakh. Right? Does that mean when whoever it was put the Tanakh together, that there were only 24 books in existence? Think about it. You open a Tanakh, were there only 24 books around? They say, we'll stick all those together and we call it the Hebrew Bible. Can't have been. And we know there weren't. There were many more. And there were people who had to make a decision, which ones shall we say are holy and which ones are not so holy? Which ones shall we keep in our holy book, which we now call the Tanakh, and which ones shall we not keep in our holy book? Now, if you haven't thought of that before, and I suspect most of you haven't, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? That there were lots and lots of books of Jewish interest, books of Jewish content that they knew about and they left out. Many of these are collected together and they're called the Apocrypha. Many of them are in Greek. They contain books like the Maccabees, second book of Ruth, or was it Esther? I can't remember. It's the book of Esther. There are the book of Tobias, the book of Ecclesiasticus, it's now called, the Wisdom of Ben Sirach. They're in this collection called the Apocrypha. So we have there lots of things of Jewish interest and about Jewish people and Jewish things. So you can see just from these few examples that I've given that although it seems to be that during this 100-year period when nothing is recorded about the Jewish people, it's not the dead times. Things were happening. And in fact, very, very, very important things were happening in relationship to Judaism. This is the period of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly. Now, this is a very, very difficult thing to define because, frankly, we don't know who they were. You've heard of them, have you not? You've heard of the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah? Who on earth were they? According to Jewish tradition, they were 120 scholars, including the last of the prophets, Rabbi, Zechariah, Malachi, and they all formed a body, a group, according to Jewish tradition, and they established lots of very important things. The problem is scholars really don't know if the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah actually existed or who they were. They are mentioned a number of times in rabbinic literature, in Midrash, in Gemara. Not many, but quite a number of times the name has come. You will be familiar with it from Pirkei Avot, like the very first Mishnah. Yeah. Moses received the Torah on Sinai and handed it down to Joshua, to the elders, to the men of the great synagogue. Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. But who they actually were, it's impossible for us to define. There are scholars who think they didn't actually exist, and there are scholars who think they did exist, or something like a group, a body of scholars must have existed and worked together. And the reason they came to the conclusion is actually a very simple one, is because of the ending, is because of what the results that they achieved. We have those. It is believed that during this silent period, the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, first of all, busied themselves with canonizing the Bible. That means doing exactly what I spoke about a few minutes ago, deciding this is a holy book, this is a holy book, this is a holy book, but this isn't, and that one isn't. We'll leave those out, we'll put those in. The canonization of the Tanakh in itself is difficult to determine because what is the last book virtually of the Tanakh that was, or rather, the last book that was put into the Tanakh? Any idea?
Yeah.
Shiashirim. And who was it who was arguing for the sanctity of Shiashirim? Who was it? Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was passionate that the Shiashirim, Song of Songs, must be in the Tanakh. But when did he die?
950.
You're way out this time. Yeah, 135 CE. Much longer after, hundreds of years after the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. Now that in itself is a fascinating thing, that the Bible was not, the Tanakh was not finalized until after Rabbi Akiva's time, 135. The Mishnah was compiled very soon after that, when 200-ish. The Mishnah by Rabbi Judah the Prince was about 200. And only 70 odd years before then, Rabbi Akiva is still arguing that he wants Shiashirim in the Tanakh. But most of the books of the Tanakh we believe, were finalized by the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, whoever these people were. They established our liturgy. There are many things. Oh, okay. There were many things in our liturgy that were fixed by the unshaken Esnagadullah. They wrote, we believe, the Amida. They composed the Amida. There are prayers that they said we should say on a regular basis, which were said in the temple. I don't know if you are aware that the brachot around the Shema, particularly Emet v'Yatziv, that we say after the Shema, Ahava Rabbah, these prayers are so ancient. We are saying today tefillot that were said in the temple. That's mind-blowing. We're still saying exactly the same words as they said then. It was the unshaken Estagdola we believed, or we are taught, who put all these things together. They also established a very important principle, which is asus yagla Torah, to make a fence around the Torah. That is to say that if Shabbat, as an example, and many examples, many, if Shabbat comes in at 4 o'clock, you actually make Shabbat at 3 o'clock to make sure you don't break Shabbat. If you're rushing home from work and you've got an hour's grace, although it's still Shabbat already, but it's not as serious as if you were to break it an hour later. That's making a fence around the Torah. So there's no doubt that during this period of the Dark Ages, things were very, very, very far from dark. And according to lots of people, it was silent only in the terms of there were no new books added to the Tanakh, no new more holy books, but intellectually, it was probably one of the most productive periods in Jewish history.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a great historical lecture there of things we don't think about, but it was great. Thank you very much. I will say goodbye to those on Zoom, and we'll see you all next